Andrew Jackson was President of the United States from 1829 to 1837. 8 years. Just 8 years that fundamentally changed America forever. Changed how government works. Changed which territories belonged to America. Changed who had rights and who didn't. Jackson expanded American power across the continent. Jackson expanded American territory westward through aggressive removal policies and military action. Jackson expanded American democracy, but exclusively for white Americans, a narrow slice of the population. But in doing these things, Jackson destroyed Native American nations. Jackson refused to enforce the Supreme Court when it ruled against him. Jackson strengthened slavery and expanded it into new territories. Jackson centralized executive power in ways that would shape the presidency for centuries to come. This is the fundamental contradiction of Andrew Jackson. This is the core contradiction we must understand. This is why his presidency matters so profoundly. This is why understanding Jackson's legacy is absolutely crucial for understanding America today. Jackson is remembered in American popular culture and textbooks as the president who expanded democracy and stood up for the common man against the wealthy and powerful. He is celebrated as a hero, an American icon. Streets across the country are named after him. His portrait hangs prominently in the White House. He appears on currency. But Jackson is also directly and personally responsible for the Indian Removal Act, one of the most morally catastrophic pieces of legislation in American history. Jackson is responsible for orchestrating the Trail of Tears. Jackson is responsible for the deaths of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw people. Jackson is responsible for the forced displacement of over 100,000 Native Americans from their ancestral homelands. Jackson is responsible for the expansion of slavery into new territories, setting the stage for civil war. Jackson is responsible for refusing to enforce a Supreme Court decision, asserting that a president could ignore the courts. This is the profound contradiction we have to grapple with when we study Jackson. How do we understand a president who was simultaneously a champion of democracy for some people and a perpetrator of genocide against others? How do we remember a leader whose presidency both expanded rights for a specific group and systematically destroyed the rights and lives of millions of others? How do we make sense of a man who changed America in transformative ways, some of them beneficial and others catastrophic? This is video 23 of Jackson's America series, and it is the final video in this comprehensive series about one president's impact on a nation. This is the culminating story of Jackson's legacy, what his presidency meant for America then, what it means for America now, and why understanding Jackson is absolutely crucial for understanding ourselves and our country. This is the story of power and its contradictions. This is the story of how one ambitious, determined man with the right political moment can change the fundamental trajectory of a nation. This is the story of what happens when democracy is expanded for some, while being systematically denied to others. And this is the story of why all of that matters profoundly. Andrew Jackson served as president for 8 consecutive years, from 1829 to 1837. During those 8 years, the United States underwent transformative expansion and change, some of it positive in some respects, much of it devastating for others. Population grew at one of the fastest rates in American history. The American population in 1829 was approximately 12 million people. By 1837, it had grown to approximately 17 million people. That represents growth of about 40% in just 8 years. This was one of the fastest periods of population growth in American history, a reflection of immigration, natural increase, and Western expansion. Territory expanded dramatically across the continent. Jackson supported and championed the Western expansion of the United States. The Indian Removal Act, which Jackson championed and Congress passed, resulted in the forced removal of approximately 100,000 Native American people from the Southeast, from their ancestral homelands where they had lived for generations. These people were forced to relocate west of the Mississippi River to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma.
Slavery expanded in absolute numbers and geographic reach. The number of enslaved people in the United States in 1829 was approximately 2.2 million. By 1837, it had grown to approximately 2.8 million. That is growth of about 27% in just 8 years. But more importantly, slavery expanded geographically. As American territory expanded westward into new states and territories, slavery expanded into those new territories. Slavery became less of a regional phenomenon limited to the South and became increasingly a national institution. Federal power expanded dramatically. Jackson centralized power in the executive branch in unprecedented ways. Jackson fought with Congress. Jackson challenged the Supreme Court. Jackson asserted the power of the president over the other branches of government. Jackson believed the president represented the people and could act on their behalf, even if Congress or the courts disagreed. Democratic participation expanded, but only for white men. White male voter participation increased significantly during Jackson's presidency. The property requirements for voting were reduced or eliminated. More white men could vote. More white men participated in politics. White men had more voice in government than ever before.
But rights contracted for everyone else. Native Americans lost their rights. They were stripped of their sovereignty and forced from their homes. Enslaved people lost rights. Slavery actually expanded rather than contracted. Women had no rights. Women's position did not improve under Jackson and in some ways declined. Free black people lost rights. The gap between free whites and free black people widened considerably during this period. The fundamental contradiction is this: rights expanded for one group while contracting for everyone else. This is the fundamental contradiction that defines Jackson's presidency. Rights expanded for some while contracting for others. Democracy advanced for some while being systematically denied to others. And this contradiction, this fundamental American contradiction, defines not just Jackson's presidency, but American history from this period forward. Andrew Jackson believed passionately in American expansion. Jackson believed the United States should expand westward. Jackson believed that American citizens should have access to land and economic opportunity in the West. Jackson believed this expansion was not just desirable, but inevitable. This belief in expansion was not unique to Jackson. It was widespread among white Americans. Most white Americans believed in expansion. This belief was called manifest destiny. Americans believed it was their destiny, their God-given destiny, to expand across the continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Americans believed this expansion was inevitable. Americans believed this expansion was right, justified, and sanctioned by history and providence. Jackson made this belief the official policy of the United States government. Jackson used the full power of the federal government to facilitate expansion. Jackson removed the obstacles to expansion, and the greatest obstacle, in Jackson's view, was Native Americans who lived on the land that Americans wanted. Native Americans were living on the land that white Americans wanted to settle. Native Americans were blocking expansion and development from white Americans' perspective. Native Americans had to be removed. That was Jackson's conclusion. Jackson ordered their removal. The Indian Removal Act was the legal instrument of this policy. The act gave the president power to negotiate removal treaties with Native American nations. The act provided federal funds for removal. The act made removal official government policy. Jackson used this act to remove over 100,000 Native Americans from their homelands. Over 100,000 Native Americans were forcibly removed. They were coerced and forced from their homeland. They were forced to walk to Indian territory west of the Mississippi. Thousands died on the journey, from disease, starvation, exposure, and despair. Their nations were destroyed. Their societies were dismantled. Their way of life was eliminated. This was the human and cultural cost of American expansion under Jackson. This was the cost of making manifest destiny government policy. This was the cost of prioritizing white American expansion before human rights and human lives. But most white Americans didn't see this as a cost. Most white Americans celebrated expansion. Most white Americans saw the removal of Native Americans as necessary and justified. Most white Americans didn't think about the people dying on the Trail of Tears. Most white Americans thought about the new land available for settlement. Most white Americans thought about economic opportunity. Most white Americans thought about building a great nation. This is how genocide works in practice. Genocide doesn't always look like what we typically think of as genocide. Sometimes it looks like government policy. Sometimes it looks like expansion. Sometimes it looks like progress. Sometimes it looks like destiny. But the result is the same: the elimination of a people, the destruction of a nation, the erasure of a culture. Andrew Jackson's presidency coincided with the expansion of slavery in America, not just in absolute numbers, but in geographic reach and political power. The cotton gin had been invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney. The cotton gin made cotton production incredibly efficient compared to hand processing. Cotton became incredibly profitable. Cotton production expanded dramatically across the South, and cotton production required massive amounts of enslaved labor. As cotton production expanded exponentially, the demand for enslaved people increased exponentially. The slave trade, both domestic slave trade, where enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the Lower South, and the international slave trade, expanded. Enslaved people were literally bought and sold like commodities. They were torn from their families in Virginia and Maryland and the Carolinas and sold to the brutal cotton plantations of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Families were separated. Children were torn from their parents. People were sold into brutal conditions. The human suffering was immense. Jackson's expansion of American territory westward into new states and territories included and facilitated the expansion of slavery into new territories. As white Americans moved west following Jackson's removal of Native Americans, they brought slavery with them. Slavery expanded into new states. Slavery expanded into new territories. Slavery became increasingly entrenched in American society at every level, economically, politically, and socially. Some Americans opposed slavery. Some Americans believed slavery was morally wrong and should be abolished. Some Americans wanted to limit slavery's expansion into new territories. But Jackson did not champion these causes. Jackson was himself a slaveholder. Jackson owned enslaved people. Jackson benefited personally from slavery. Jackson was invested in the system of slavery. Moreover, Jackson's expansion policies directly facilitated slavery's expansion. By removing Native Americans from their lands and opening those lands to American settlement, Jackson made vast new territory available for slaveholders to settle and develop with slave labor. New land meant new economic opportunity for slavery. New land meant new wealth for slaveholders. Jackson's policies directly enabled slavery to expand. The result was transformative and catastrophic for American history. Slavery, which was slowly dying out in northern states and was slowly becoming limited to certain southern states, became increasingly national. Slavery became central to the American economy in ways it hadn't been before. Slavery became defended as a positive good rather than a necessary evil. Slavery became increasingly entrenched in American politics. This is part of Jackson's legacy. Jackson expanded slavery. Jackson facilitated slavery's expansion. Jackson did not oppose slavery. And as a result, the institution that was slowly dying became revived and strengthened. This would have massive consequences. The conflicts between free states and slave states would intensify over the following decades. The question of whether slavery would expand into new territories became the central political issue of the 1840s and 1850s. These conflicts would eventually lead to the Civil War, 30 years after Jackson left office. Andrew Jackson centralized power in the executive branch in unprecedented ways. Jackson asserted presidential power over Congress. Jackson asserted presidential power over the Supreme Court. This represented a fundamental shift in how American government worked. The Constitution had established 3 branches of government with explicit checks and balances. The president was one branch, Congress was another branch, the Supreme Court was a third branch. Each branch was supposed to check and balance the power of the others. The system was designed so that no single branch could become too powerful. But Jackson didn't accept this system of checks and balances. Jackson believed the president had broad power to act on behalf of the people. Jackson believed the president represented the people directly. Jackson believed the president could act on behalf of the people, even if Congress or the Supreme Court disagreed. Jackson challenged Congress repeatedly during his presidency. Jackson vetoed legislation he disagreed with. Jackson vetoed legislation more often than any president before him. He used the veto power in ways his predecessors had not. Jackson used the veto as a tool to assert presidential power over Congress and to prevent Congress from passing laws Jackson opposed. Jackson challenged the Supreme Court directly and dramatically. When the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia that the Cherokee Nation had rights and that Georgia had no jurisdiction in Cherokee territory, Jackson refused to enforce the decision. Jackson reportedly said that the Supreme Court had made its decision, now let it enforce it. Jackson asserted that he, as president, didn't have to follow the Supreme Court's ruling. This was revolutionary and dangerous. This was a president asserting that he could ignore the Supreme Court. This was a president asserting that his power was above the other branches of government. This was a president suggesting that the Constitution's checks and balances didn't apply to him. Jackson was not the first president to assert executive power, but Jackson asserted it more forcefully than his predecessors. Jackson asserted it more openly and publicly. Jackson asserted it with more confidence and swagger. And crucially, the American political system let him do it. Congress didn't stop him. Congress accepted his vetoes. Congress accepted his removal policies. Congress accepted his assertion of power. There were no serious attempts to check Jackson's power. There was no serious movement to impeach him or to constrain him constitutionally. This set a precedent for American government. After Jackson, presidents had more power than before. Presidents believed they could act unilaterally. Presidents believed they could override the other branches of government if necessary. Presidents believed they had broad latitudes to act as they saw fit. This is part of Jackson's legacy to American government. Jackson strengthened the presidency. Jackson centralized power in the executive branch. Jackson showed that a president with will and popularity could override the constitutional checks and balances. This would have long-term consequences for American government. Future presidents would assert even more power. The presidency would grow stronger relative to Congress and the Supreme Court. The balance of power would shift increasingly towards the executive branch over the following centuries.
Jackson is celebrated in American history as a great champion of democracy, and in some ways, this characterization is accurate, but it requires significant qualification. White male democracy expanded under Jackson. Voting eligibility expanded for white men. More white men could vote. The property requirements for voting were reduced or eliminated in many states during this period. More white men participated in politics. White men had more voice in government than ever before. Jackson was the first president to be elected as a champion of the common man against the wealthy and aristocratic elite. Jackson presented himself as a friend of ordinary people. Jackson had not been born wealthy. Jackson had worked his way up through military service and political ambition. Jackson represented a different kind of president than the wealthy, aristocratic presidents before him. White men responded enthusiastically to this message. White men voted for Jackson. White men saw Jackson as their champion. White men believed Jackson was fighting for their interests. And in some ways, Jackson did support policies that benefited white men. Jackson supported expansion, and white men wanted to expand westward. Jackson facilitated that expansion, and white men benefited from new land becoming available. White men got new territories. White men got economic opportunity. White men got to build a new life in the West. So Jackson's democracy did expand, but it expanded exclusively for white men, and it expanded at the expense of everyone else. This is the fundamental contradiction of Jacksonian democracy. Democracy expanded for some while being systematically denied to others. Rights advanced for some while being violated for others. This is not democracy in any universal sense. This is oligarchy. This is the rule of some people over others. And this contradiction defines American democracy from Jackson's time forward. American democracy continued to expand for white men. American democracy continued to be denied to everyone else. It would take a civil war, a Reconstruction period, and eventually a civil rights movement to begin to expand democracy and rights to everyone. What was the actual human cost of Jackson's policies? This is the question we must ask. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died on the Trail of Tears. Approximately 3,500 Creek died on removal journeys. Approximately 2,000 Choctaw died on removal journeys. Thousands of Chickasaw and Seminole died. In total, thousands of Native American people died directly as a result of Jackson's removal policies. Some estimates suggest the total death toll from removal was over 15,000 people.
These were not abstract numbers. These were real people. These were real deaths. These were families destroyed. These were children torn from their parents. These were communities eliminated. These were entire nations devastated. These were graves dug in unfamiliar territory, bodies buried far from ancestral lands. Hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were enslaved during the period when slavery expanded under Jackson. These people experienced the horror of slavery in its most brutal form. These people experienced being bought and sold like property. These people experienced families being separated at the auction block. These people experienced brutal labor in cotton fields under the whip. These people experienced violence and degradation and dehumanization on a scale almost incomprehensible. Millions of Native American people were displaced. They were forced from their homeland. They lost everything they had built. They lost everything they knew. They lost their way of life. They lost their independence. They lost their identity as peoples connected to specific lands. This was the cost of American expansion under Jackson. This was the cost of making manifest destiny government policy. This was the cost of putting white American expansion and economic opportunity before human rights and human lives. And most white Americans didn't pay this cost. White Americans benefited from the expansion. White Americans got new land. White Americans got economic opportunity. White Americans got the benefits of slavery without the brutality. White Americans built fortunes on the labor of enslaved people and on land taken from Native Americans. This is the legacy of Jackson. This is the legacy of American expansion. This is the legacy of American democracy that only extended to some people. This is the human cost we must acknowledge and remember. How is Jackson remembered in America today? This is important to understand. Jackson is remembered as a great president. Jackson is remembered as a champion of democracy and the common man. Jackson is remembered as a friend of ordinary people. Jackson is celebrated in American culture. Jackson has monuments and memorials. Jackson has a portrait hanging in the White House. Jackson appears on currency. In American history textbooks, Jackson is often presented quite positively. Students learn that Jackson expanded democracy. Students learn that Jackson stood up to the wealthy and powerful. Students learn that Jackson represented ordinary people. Students learn that Jackson expanded American territory. But what students don't always learn is that Jackson's democracy only extended to white men. What students don't always learn is that Jackson destroyed Native American nations. What students don't always learn is that Jackson refused to enforce the Supreme Court. What students don't always learn is that Jackson expanded slavery. What students don't always learn is that thousands of people died as a result of Jackson's policies.
This is a failure of historical memory. This is a failure of American education. This is how history gets distorted. This is how we remember the good parts and conveniently forget the bad parts. This is how we create historical figures who are partly myth and partly reality. It's easier to remember Jackson as a great president than to grapple with the complexity. It's easier to celebrate his expansion of democracy than to acknowledge his destruction of Native American peoples. It's easier to admire his strength and will than to condemn his crimes against humanity. But this is a mistake. If we want to understand America, we have to grapple with the full legacy of Jackson. We have to acknowledge both the expansion of rights for some and the violation of rights for others. We have to acknowledge both his strengths and his crimes. We have to see him completely, not in sanitized form. Jackson's presidency had profound and lasting impact on American government structure. Jackson showed that a president could centralize power in unprecedented ways. Jackson showed that a president could override Congress. Jackson showed that a president could ignore the Supreme Court. Future presidents would follow this example. Lincoln would use executive power to wage the Civil War. Grant would assert executive power. Theodore Roosevelt would greatly expand executive power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would assert massive executive power during the Great Depression and World War II. Every modern president has had more power than the presidents before Jackson. The presidency has continued to expand and centralize power over the centuries following Jackson. Jackson showed that a president could appeal directly to the people. Jackson presented himself as the champion of the common man against the wealthy and powerful. Jackson bypassed Congress and the elite and appealed directly to ordinary voters. Future presidents would follow this model. Future presidents would appeal directly to the people. Future presidents would present themselves as fighting on behalf of ordinary people against corrupt elites. This is part of Jackson's legacy to the American presidency. Jackson changed how the presidency works. Jackson changed how presidents exercise power. Jackson changed how presidents relate to the people.
Jackson also showed that a president can pursue policies even if they violate law and constitutional rights. Jackson removed Native Americans in violation of the Constitution and in violation of treaties that were the law of the land. Jackson refused to enforce the Supreme Court. Jackson did this because he had the political power and popular support to do so. Future presidents would sometimes follow this example, violating constitutional rights when they had sufficient political power. This is the troubling legacy Jackson left to the presidency, the idea that a strong president can override law and constitution if the president has sufficient political power and popular support. Jackson's expansion of slavery would have catastrophic consequences for American history. The expansion of slavery into new territories created intense conflict. Northern states opposed slavery expansion into new states and territories. Southern states demanded slavery expansion. This conflict intensified during the 1840s and 1850s. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had attempted to balance free and slave states. For every free state admitted, a slave state would be admitted. But the expansion of territory under Jackson disrupted this balance. New territories meant new states. New states meant the central question: would they be free or slave? This question dominated American politics for 40 years. The question of slavery expansion led to the Kansas-Nebraska crisis. The question led to fights in Congress. The question led to violence. The question led to the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed slavery expansion. The election of Lincoln led to Southern secession. Southern states left the Union because they feared Lincoln would prevent slavery expansion. The result was the Civil War. Jackson did not cause the Civil War, but Jackson's policies, his expansion of territory, his facilitation of slavery expansion into new territories, contributed significantly to the conditions that led to the Civil War. The Civil War killed over 620,000 people. The Civil War destroyed the South economically and physically. The Civil War devastated American society. The Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in American history. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all other American wars combined. Jackson's removal policies and slavery expansion were not the only causes of the Civil War. There were many factors, but they were significant contributors. Jackson's policies intensified the contradictions that the Civil War was fought to resolve.
Why does Jackson's presidency matter today, in 2024? Why does a president from nearly 200 years ago still matter to us now? Jackson's presidency teaches us about executive power and its dangers. Jackson showed that a president can accumulate and centralize power. Jackson showed that a president can override other branches of government. Jackson showed that a president can do things that are arguably unconstitutional if he has sufficient political power and popular support. We see echoes of this in modern presidents. Modern presidents have expanded executive power. Modern presidents have issued executive orders that bypass Congress. Modern presidents have challenged the courts. Modern presidents have asserted power beyond what the Constitution seems to allow. This is Jackson's legacy. Jackson showed that presidential power could expand. Modern presidents have continued this expansion. Jackson's presidency teaches us about the contradiction between democracy for some and authoritarianism for others. Jackson expanded rights for white men while denying rights to everyone else. This contradiction persists in America today. America prides itself on being a democracy, but America has a long history of democracy being denied to some people. This contradiction is still being worked out. This contradiction is still causing conflict. This contradiction is still defining American politics today. Jackson's presidency teaches us about expansion and its human costs. Jackson expanded American territory, but the cost was the destruction of Native American nations. Today, we see similar conflicts over development, over resource extraction, over the expansion of human society at the expense of indigenous peoples. We see indigenous peoples fighting to protect their land and their way of life. We see the same tensions that existed under Jackson existing today. Understanding Jackson helps us understand contemporary issues. Understanding Jackson helps us see how expansion benefits some while harming others. Understanding Jackson helps us grapple with the moral questions of growth and development that confront us today.
Andrew Jackson's presidency expanded American democracy for some while systematically denying it to others. Jackson's presidency expanded American territory at tremendous human cost. Jackson's presidency centralized executive power in ways that would have lasting consequences for American government. Jackson is celebrated as a great president, and in some ways this celebration is justified. Jackson did expand rights for white men. Jackson did assert presidential power. Jackson did facilitate American expansion.
But Jackson is also directly responsible for genocide. Jackson is responsible for the removal of Native Americans from their homeland. Jackson is responsible for the expansion of slavery into new territories. Jackson is responsible for the refusal to enforce the Supreme Court. Jackson is responsible for the centralization of power. We have to grapple with this contradiction. We have to acknowledge both the expansion of rights for some and the violation of rights for others. We have to acknowledge both his strengths and his crimes. We have to see Jackson completely and honestly. This is what history requires of us. History is not simple. History is not just good and bad. History is complicated. History is full of contradiction. History is full of people who did good things and bad things simultaneously. Jackson is one of those people. Jackson expanded democracy and facilitated genocide. Jackson was a great president and a perpetrator of crimes. Jackson changed America and destroyed nations. Understanding Jackson means understanding this contradiction. Understanding Jackson means understanding America. Understanding Jackson means understanding the contradictions that still define our country. Understanding Jackson means understanding the work we still have to do. America is still dealing with the legacy of Jackson. America is still dealing with the consequences of Native American removal. America is still dealing with the consequences of slavery. America is still dealing with the contradictions between democracy and authoritarianism. America is still working through the tensions Jackson created. Jackson's presidency ended in 1837, but Jackson's legacy continues. Jackson's legacy is woven into American history. Jackson's legacy shapes American politics. Jackson's legacy defines American contradictions. This is Jackson's America. This is the legacy of a presidency that divided a nation in fundamental ways. This is the story of power and its contradictions. This is the story of what happens when democracy is expanded for some while being systematically denied to others. Understanding this story is crucial for understanding America. Understanding the story is crucial for understanding ourselves. Understanding the story is crucial for building a better future where democracy and rights are truly extended to everyone, not just to some.